rancher, buried his daughter. Years ago, until the Bigfoot dug up her grave. He buried her with his own hands, a small grave, a wooden doll, and silence for years, until one day. He found the grave torn open. No body. Just footprints. Huge. Bare. Leading into the woods. He followed, gun in hand, heart in pieces. And there beneath the trees the creature was kneeling, not to harm, but to grieve. It held the doll. Whispered something into the wind. He didn't fire. He couldn't. Because pain recognizes pain even across species. That night, they sat by firelight, man and beast, grieving the same child, in different ways. By dawn, it was gone. But the grave had been rebuilt, and on the stone, a symbol, a hand, small, etched beside a larger one. Some say it was just a monster, but he knew better. It came to mourn, not to steal. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. The sun was sinking behind the western hills, laying its dying light across a lonely patch of land behind the ranch. The grass was brittle, the sky bruised gray, and the wind carried the scent of rain and old sorrow. John Harland knelt at the grave of his daughter, Elsie, the little girl he'd buried years ago. A single candle flickered beside a wooden cross, its flame bending beneath the breath of the cold. In his trembling hand was a small wooden doll, her favorite toy, worn smooth by years of grief. He placed it gently on the mound of earth, whispering a name he hadn't spoken aloud in months. Then, something caught his eye. The soil was wrong, uneven, torn. He touched it. The dirt was fresh, the coffin's edge splintered open. There was no body inside. Only the broken doll, and a set of massive footprints pressed deep into the wet ground, leading toward the forest. John froze, blood roaring in his ears. A cry rose in his throat but died in the wind. Then his grief hardened into fury. He lit his oil lantern, gripped his rifle, and followed the tracks into the trees, unaware that what waited in the darkness wasn't a monster, but something far older and far more human. Part 1. The Trail of Shadows. The forest beyond the ranch had always been a place John Harland respected, not feared. It was where he hunted elk in the fall, where he'd once taught his daughter to ride before the fever took her. But that night, it didn't feel like the same woods. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. Fog clung low between the trees, curling around his boots as he climbed the ridge. The beam from his lantern swung in slow arcs, catching glimpses of broken branches and deep, unnatural footprints pressed into the mud. Each print was wide as a frying pan, sunk inches into the ground. Whatever had made them was massive and close. John's fingers tightened around the rifle. His breath came out in harsh clouds. The anger inside him burned hotter than his fear. He wasn't thinking of danger, or of death, only of the open grave, the broken coffin, the thought of someone or something desecrating the last memory of his little girl. He whispered her name once, softly, Elsie. The forest didn't answer. Only the wind moaned through the pines, like a mourning voice. He followed the tracks deeper, across the dry creek bed and into the valley. The fog thickened, swallowing sound. His boots sank with every step, and the night grew colder. Somewhere ahead, A faint orange glow flickered between the trees. At first, he thought it was lightning. Then he realized it was firelight. He crouched, moving slower now. His heart pounded as he crept toward the glow, rifle raised. The trees opened into a small clearing surrounded by rock and fern, and there, just beyond the fire, something moved. John froze. The creature was enormous, hunched low beside the flames. Its fur caught the firelight like damp moss, shimmering gold and brown. In its great hands, it held something small, delicate. John squinted through the haze. It was a doll. His daughter's doll. Every instinct in him screamed to shoot to end whatever horror stood before him. But his finger hesitated on the trigger, because what he saw next didn't make sense. The creature, the Bigfoot, the myth whispered by cowhands and drunks at the saloon, wasn't tearing or devouring. It was kneeling. Before it lay a small bundle bones, wrapped in animal fur. The creature's massive hands moved with impossible care, arranging the doll upon the tiny ribcage. Then it placed a flat stone over the chest and pressed its palm to the earth, bowing its head. John's breath caught. It wasn't desecrating the dead. It was burying them. For a long moment, he couldn't move. His body trembled with a confusion that reached deeper than fear. The rifle sagged in his grip. The anger that had driven him into the forest began to crumble under the weight of something else. Awe, disbelief, and a strange, unbearable grief. He stepped forward, the lantern light spilling across the clearing. The creature turned, its eyes deep, amber. Ancient met his through the smoke. For an instant, John thought he saw human sorrow there. Not the gaze of a beast, but the look of something that understood loss. They stared at each other, motionless. The only sound was the hiss of rain beginning to fall, soft against the fire. John lowered the gun. The barrel touched the wet ground. He took another step forward, then another, until he stood just a few feet from the creature. It didn't move, didn't growl, didn't run. Slowly. It lifted one arm long, matted fur dripping with rain, and placed its hand over its heart. Then, with deliberate grace, it touched the mound of earth it had made. John understood, though no words were spoken. This wasn't a monster. It was a mourner. The rain fell harder, extinguishing the last of the flames. In the dim glow of the lantern, the creature's face softened. It made a low, rumbling sound, not anger, but something like a prayer. John felt the sting of tears rise behind his eyes. For the first time since Elsie's death, he wasn't alone in his grief. His rifle slipped from his hand, forgotten in the mud. He knelt beside the small mound, his knees sinking into the cold earth. The creature watched him quietly. Then, as if understanding what the man had lost, it took a step back into the shadows. John looked down at the mound of soil. Beneath it, his daughter's remains moved, tended, and laid to rest again by something the world called a monster. He pressed a trembling palm to the dirt and whispered, "Thank you." When he looked up, the clearing was empty. Only the rain remained, whispering through the leaves. The footprints led back into the forest, fading into darkness. John stayed there until dawn, staring at the fresh mound, feeling the first warmth of peace in years. And as the light crept over the horizon, he saw it beside the grave, etched into the wet soil a single mark, shaped like a giant handprint beside a child's smaller one. He didn't know if it was meant as a sign, a promise, or a farewell. But in that quiet, misty morning, John Harland finally understood some creatures don't come to haunt the living. They come to finish what grief never could. Part 2. The Ritual. The cave opened like a wound in the side of the mountain, black, breathing, and damp with mist. John Harland stopped just outside the entrance, his lantern held low, the flame trembling with each gust of wind. The air smelled of smoke and wet stone. He could hear something from inside, a rhythmic sound, slow and deep, like the breathing of the earth itself. He crouched behind a boulder and peered into the cavern. The firelight flickered across the stone walls, painting everything in shifting shades of amber and shadow. And there it was, the creature from the clearing. Bigfoot. It was larger than any man he'd ever seen, its fur a mix of gray and brown, its massive shoulders rising and falling with quiet intent. But what froze John wasn't its size. It was what the creature was doing. Before the fire, laid carefully upon a piece of tanned hide, was a small skeleton, tiny bones, fragile and pale against the dark stone. Around it were scattered tokens, carved stones, wildflowers, a feather, and the little wooden doll John had made for Elsie when she was 5. Bigfoot moved with surprising gentleness, adjusting the bones, brushing soil from them with its thick fingers. Then it reached for the doll, holding it as though it were something sacred. The creature pressed the toy to its forehead for a moment, eyes closed, before laying it on the small rib cage, just above where a heart would have been. John's breath caught in his throat. The creature bowed its head, both hands pressed to the earth beside the small body. It began to hum low, resonant, almost human, a sound that filled the cave like a prayer. John felt his stomach twist. He wanted to move, to run, but his body stayed rooted to the ground. Every instinct screamed monster, but the sight before him spoke of something else, something ancient, sacred, and unbearably sad. The hum grew deeper, echoing off the walls. It wasn't just sound. It was rhythm, like a heartbeat, like breath, like the whisper of rain. The Bigfoot wasn't desecrating. It was performing a ritual. John realized then that he'd misjudged everything. The creature wasn't digging for bones. It was giving them peace. He shifted slightly, the lantern flickering as he leaned forward. The light must have caught the creature's eye, because it stopped. Slowly, it turned its head toward him. John froze. Those eyes, dark amber, wide and weary, found him in the shadows. They weren't the eyes of a beast. They were the eyes of something that had lived long enough to know pain. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled softly. Drops of water fell from the cave's ceiling, splashing into a small pool. John raised the lantern slightly, revealing his face. He expected the creature to snarl or retreat, but it didn't. It simply looked at him, breathing slow, steady. Then, in a gesture that sent a chill through John's chest, the Bigfoot lifted its massive hand and pressed it to its heart. After a pause, it lowered the same hand to the mound of earth it had made. John understood immediately. It wasn't a threat. It was a prayer. His heart began to pound, not with fear this time, but with something heavier, sorrow, maybe, or recognition. He knew what it was to bury something you loved, to dig into the earth and leave a piece of yourself behind. The Bigfoot was doing the same. He stepped out from behind the boulder, Slowly, cautiously, his boots scraping against the stone. The creature's head followed him, but it made no move to attack. "I'm not here to hurt you," John whispered. His voice echoed softly, almost swallowed by the cave. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if listening not to the words, but to the tone. John lowered the lantern. The warm light touched the bones, the doll, and the creature's weathered hands. For a long time, the two of them just stood there, facing each other, man and legend, both carrying grief that had nowhere else to go. The Bigfoot shifted its gaze from John to the small skeleton, and then back again. Slowly, it extended one arm, palm open, toward the doll lying on the chest. It wanted him to take it. John hesitated, his throat tight, then stepped closer. He knelt down beside the bones. His fingers brushed the wooden doll, now cracked. Its paint faded, but still whole. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Memories flooded in Elsie's laughter, her tiny hands gripping his thumb, her voice calling him Pa through the evening wind. Tears blurred his vision. The creature made a low, gentle sound like a hum of understanding. When John looked up again, it had lowered its head, closing its eyes in silent prayer. The fire crackled between them, its glow steady and calm. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly. But here, inside the cave, time seemed to stop. John pressed the doll to his chest, mirroring the creature's gesture. Then he placed his hand on the mound of soil beside it. For the first time since Elsie's death, the weight in his chest loosened, not gone, but lighter, shared. He whispered, voice breaking, "Thank you for putting her to rest." The creature's eyes opened again, deep, warm, and sad. It nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then, as the fire began to fade, it turned and stepped deeper into the cave's darkness. The shadows swallowed it whole. John remained kneeling. The doll pressed to his chest, tears mixing with the rain dripping from the rocks above. He wasn't sure if what he'd seen was real or something born from his grief. But when he looked at the mound of earth again, he saw the truth. The child had been laid to rest, not by hands of man, but by a creature who understood sorrow better than most humans ever would. In the silence that followed, John Harland whispered a prayer of his own, not to God, not to ghosts, but to the wild itself, for showing mercy in a language beyond words. Part 3. Two griefs meet. Rain whispered against the stone mouth of the cave. Outside, the forest shimmered in silver streaks, but inside, the fire burned low, a fragile pulse of orange light holding back the cold. John Harland stood at the edge of the glow, his boots soaked, his breath rising in pale clouds. He had followed the creature this far, through mud and grief, through disbelief and fear. Now, he was no longer sure which one of them was haunting the other. The Bigfoot knelt near the mound of earth it had made, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of its chest. Its shadow stretched across the stone wall, vast, yet strangely gentle. John's eyes fell to the small grave. The little bones were covered now by layers of fur and soil, sealed in silence. Beside it lay the broken doll, still resting where he had left it, and the tiny scarf that once belonged to his daughter, red, faded, but unmistakably hers. He stepped forward, the firelight catching his face. The creature lifted its head but didn't move. John reached into his coat and pulled out the small scarf. It still carried the faint scent of wood smoke and lavender Elsie's scent, from a time that felt like another lifetime. He knelt beside the mound, his knees cracking under his own weight. For a moment, he just stared, unable to breathe. Then, with hands that trembled like dry leaves, he spread the scarf over the small grave, smoothing it flat against the soil. His voice broke as he whispered, "Keep her warm, please." The Bigfoot tilted its head, eyes glinting with reflection of firelight. Slowly, almost reverently, it lowered itself to its knees across from him. For the first time, John wasn't afraid. They sat like that man and creature, silence thick between them. Only the sound of the rain tapping the rocks, the fire's soft crackle, and the rhythm of two hearts learning the same sorrow. John looked across the small fire. The Bigfoot's eyes were fixed on the mound. In them, he saw not savagery, not instinct, but something painfully human loss. He wondered, fleetingly, if it too had buried a child once, if this ritual was its way of remembering. The thought hit him with such force he nearly gasped. Maybe grief wasn't human. Maybe it was older, something shared between all living things that love and lose. His hand brushed the soil, and he found himself speaking softly, as though the child might hear him through the earth. "I thought I was the only one left," he murmured. "The only fool still talking to ghosts." The Bigfoot turned its gaze to him, then to the doll beside the mound. With slow, deliberate motion, it reached out one great hand and picked up the toy. John tensed for an instant, then watched as the creature held it gently, almost tenderly. It turned the doll over once, the firelight flickering across its worn face, then reached forward and extended its arm toward John. The doll lay in its open palm, offered back. John hesitated, his throat tightening. His fingers brushed the creature's as he took it, the contact brief, but warm. In that moment, something wordless passed between them, an understanding deeper than language. The creature had given him back the doll, not as a possession but as a duty, as if to say, "You're still her father. Keep her memory alive." John stared at the toy in his hands, tears spilling freely now. The fire's glow danced in his wet eyes, reflecting the pain and peace tangled together there. He whispered, "I couldn't save her." The words came like confession, hollow and heavy. The Bigfoot leaned closer, a low rumble escaping its chest, not growling, but humming, deep and steady, like comfort. It pressed its large hand to its chest, then to the mound again, repeating the motion John had seen earlier. John understood. The creature was praying, or whatever the wild called its own prayers. He mirrored the gesture, placing his weathered hand over his heart, then over the earth. For the first time, the gesture didn't feel futile. The rain outside grew softer, almost like a lullaby. The fire had burned low to embers, its glow now gentle, steady, the color of forgiveness. John lifted his gaze to the creature again. "Thank you," he whispered, "for what you did, for seeing her." The Bigfoot gave a slow, deliberate nod. Its eyes glistened with something that could only be described as compassion. Then, without breaking eye contact, it rose to its full height, tall, powerful, but calm. John rose with it, still holding the doll to his chest. For a long heartbeat, they just stood there, facing each other, both fathers, in their own way, both mourning the same fragile thing, love that time couldn't protect. Then, The creature extended its arm once more. Its open palm hovered between them, the gesture patient. Waiting. John placed his own hand against it. His fingers barely reached across the creature's palm, but the warmth there was real grounding, alive. Tears streaked through the dirt on his cheeks. The Bigfoot withdrew its hand, then slowly stepped back into the shadows beyond the firelight. Its massive frame melted into the dark, leaving behind only the echo of its breathing and the soft scent of wet earth. John stood alone again beside the mound. The fire hissed quietly, the scarf fluttered slightly in the draft, and the doll rested against his heart. But for the first time since the day he buried Elsie, the loneliness didn't feel like punishment. It felt shared. He knelt once more, pressing his palm flat against the grave. "Sleep well, baby girl," he whispered. His voice cracked, but there was peace beneath it. And outside the cave, as the last drops of rain fell through the trees, a low, distant sound carried through the forest, not a cry, not a roar, but something softer. A sound that might have been grief, or maybe grace. Part 4, The Mark of Mercy. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving behind a silence that felt like reverence. Mist clung to the low hills, soft as breath, drifting between the pines that bordered John Harlan's ranch. The world smelled of wet grass and renewal, a scent he hadn't known in years. John walked slowly up the path that led to the ridge, his boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. The rifle was gone. The lantern, too. All he carried now was the small wooden doll pressed to his chest. When he reached the hilltop, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, pale and golden, spilling across the grave. He froze. The mound was perfect, not torn, not raw. The soil had been smoothed, shaped into a gentle rise, as though molded by careful hands. The edges were clean, lined with small stones from the stream below. Someone or something had been here after him. He knelt, heart pounding. On the wooden cross, something new had appeared. A carving. Simple but deliberate, a small handprint, its fingers etched beside a much larger one. John reached out, his fingers tracing the grooves. The larger print was rough, uneven, carved with strength. The smaller one was delicate, almost childlike. Two hands. Side by side, a message left in silence. The morning light caught the carving and made it gleam faintly, the moisture on the wood shining like tears. He didn't need anyone to explain it. He understood. The Bigfoot had come back. It hadn't vanished into the forest like some phantom. It had returned to finish what both of them had started to seal the grave. Not with fear, but with grace. John sat back on his heels, breathing unsteadily. The wind brushed against his face, cool and soft. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. He placed the doll carefully on the grave, resting it against the base of the cross. The wood was cracked, faded but whole. His hand lingered there as he whispered, "She's home now, isn't she?" The forest didn't answer, but the silence felt full alive. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, memories rose like ghosts. Elsie's laughter echoing across the pasture, her tiny hands clutching the same doll. The way she'd look up at him and say, "Don't be sad, Pa. I'm right here." Tears welled, spilling freely down his weathered cheeks. But this time, they didn't hurt. They cleansed. John pressed his palm to the grave, the damp earth cool against his skin. He imagined the creature that enormous, sorrowful being kneeling here before dawn, its rough hands smoothing the soil, the same way he used to tuck the blanket around Elsie at night. The image hit him with a strange, humbling clarity. The beast had done for him what he couldn't do for himself. It had buried his grief properly. A faint sound stirred from the woods, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch. John lifted his head, eyes narrowing against the sunlight. Far beyond the mist, near the tree line, a shadow moved, massive, upright, fleeting. He didn't see its face this time. He didn't need to. He raised his hand in quiet acknowledgement, a simple gesture of gratitude. The shadow paused for a heartbeat, then vanished into the trees. He stayed there until the sun rose higher, the fog lifting from the valley below. The grave gleamed softly in the new light, the handprint carving catching the warmth of morning. It wasn't eerie. It was beautiful. John felt something stir in him, not joy exactly, but peace. A peace that had waited years beneath his grief, waiting for the right hands, the right heart, to uncover it. He exhaled deeply, the weight in his chest finally gone. A low voice, his own, but steadier than before, broke the silence. He buried her body in grief. He looked at the carved prints, the way the light touched them, and continued, voice trembling but sure. But the creature buried her again in peace. He smiled, not the brittle, half-hearted smile of a man trying to survive another day, but the kind that comes when something broken has been gently mended. The wind swept through the grass, bending it in slow waves. Birds began to call from the trees, their songs carrying across the valley. John sat there, still kneeling, his hand resting over the carving. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for forgiveness this time, but for gratitude. Thank you, he murmured to the forest. Thank you for not leaving me alone with this. As he rose to his feet, the light wrapped around him like a benediction. The west stretched endlessly before him, wide, golden, alive again. And somewhere deep in those woods, where shadows moved between sunlight and legend, the echo of a low, distant hum lingered, half prayer, half goodbye. Part 5, The Hill of Peace, the Hill of... A year passed. The seasons turned, and the hill that had once been gray and barren now bloomed with wildflowers. Yellow daisies and white asters covered the slope like a soft quilt, dancing in the wind. Above them, the sky stretched wide and pale, the kind of blue that only belonged to the quiet mornings of the West. John Harlan stood on that same hill, older now, slower, but lighter somehow. His beard had gone almost white, his hands still rough from ranch work, but his eyes, once hollow, now held something warm. At the top of the hill stood a small wooden shelter he'd built himself, just enough to shade the grave from rain and sun. Beneath it, the cross still stood firm, and nailed to one of the wooden beams above it. A new sign read, Hill of Peace. Every morning, he came here with a tin cup of coffee and sat by the grave. Sometimes he'd talk about the weather, about the cattle, about the sound of coyotes the night before. Sometimes he'd just sit and listen. And though he never said it aloud, he often felt that he wasn't alone. When the wind rustled through the pines, it carried something deeper than sound, a hum, faint but steady, echoing the rhythm of that long-ago night in the cave. It didn't frighten him. It comforted him. One afternoon, as the sun began to lower, a lone rider came up the trail, a traveler, a young man in a dusted coat, hat low over his brow. He dismounted near the fence, eyes scanning the place with curiosity. "Beautiful hill you got here," he said, his voice breaking the hush of the valley. John nodded, tipping his hat slightly. The traveler squinted at the grave, at the flowers neatly arranged, the stones clean, the cross polished smooth by care. He looked back at John. "You keep this place in fine shape," he said. "Most folks don't tend to grave that often. What makes this one so special?" John looked at him for a moment, long enough that the question seemed to fade into the quiet. He smiled, small and gentle. "This hill," he said softly, "used to be full of pain." He looked toward the forest in the distance, where the trees stood dark and ancient against the horizon. "But now," he continued, "it's watched over by something that doesn't let sorrow stay." The traveler frowned slightly, uncertain whether he'd heard right. Watched over by who John's gaze didn't move from the tree line. The sun was dipping low now, painting the pines in honey and gold. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said with a chuckle. Then, after a pause, added quietly, "Let's just say, not all guardians have wings." The traveler tilted his head, as if about to ask more, but something in John's tone silenced him. Instead, he nodded, looked once more at the grave, and whispered, "It's a peaceful place." John's smile deepened. "That's the idea." When the traveler rode away, his horse's hooves fading down the trail, the hill grew still again. John remained seated, his hands folded on his knees. The air was warm, the grass swayed gently, and somewhere beyond the ridge came a low, distant sound, a rumble that might have been thunder, or maybe something else. It wasn't harsh or frightening. It was low, resonant, familiar, like the echo of a memory breathing through the trees. John looked toward the sound, eyes glinting with quiet understanding. He didn't need to see it. He knew. Somewhere in those woods, the creature still roamed, watching, guarding, living. The same being that had once knelt beside him in sorrow now lingered in peace. He whispered into the wind, "Thank you, old friend." The evening light began to fade, draping the world in gold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden doll now mended, its cracks filled and edges polished smooth. He placed it on the grave, beside the carved symbol that still marked the cross, a small hand beside a larger one. As the sun dipped below the hills, that carving caught the last light, glowing as though alive. John closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "You buried her once," he said softly, almost to himself. "But some spirits never leave. They stay to guard the peace you couldn't find." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of pine and rain. Somewhere deep in the forest, there came that soft, distant hum, half growl, half lullaby, the sound of the wild remembering. John smiled, tipping his hat toward the trees. Then he turned toward the cabin, his figure small against the wide, endless west. Behind him, the hill stood bathed in fading sunlight, a place of loss once, now a place of peace. And as the last light sank behind the mountains, the hum from the woods faded too, not ending, just resting, like a prayer finally answered. Evening settled over the ranch like an old memory, soft, golden, and kind. John Harlan sat on the porch, harmonica in hand, the wood beneath him warm from the last light of day. He played a tune so gentle it felt like the wind itself had slowed to listen. Out beyond the fence, the fields shimmered under the falling sun. A flock of birds rose from the pines, wings flashing silver as they crossed the open sky. John watched them go, the corners of his mouth curling into a quiet smile. The forest beyond was still, peaceful, watching. And though the years had thinned his hair and slowed his step, he knew somewhere out there, something still kept its silent vigil. If you believe kindness can heal even the wildest things, leave A in the comments. Before you sleep tonight, remember sometimes, kindness is the only fire still burning in the cold. The harmonica fell silent. The sun dipped low. And as twilight gathered over the wide, untamed land, the west whispered back a sound half wind, half grace, a call that never truly ends.